He almost walked out. The bill was paid. His jacket was on. Ruby was waiting at home, probably asleep in front of the television, with the dog pressed against her feet. Cole Maddox was 37 years old, bone-tired, and carrying the kind of exhaustion that doesn't come from a single hard day. It comes from years of hard days, stacked one on top of the other, until a man can barely remember what it felt like to not be tired. He was 2 steps from the door when the man's voice rose above the clatter of the diner. "I just think you could have mentioned it. That's all I'm saying." Before I wasted a whole evening. Cole stopped. He didn't turn around. Not yet. He stood there with his hand not quite touching the door and listened to the silence that followed, that particular, awful silence that happens when everyone in a room hears something cruel and decides it's not their problem. He knew that silence. He'd heard it in other places, in other forms. It was the sound of people choosing to look away. Cole looked at the door, thought about Ruby, thought about the stack of invoices sitting on the kitchen counter. Then the man spoke again, and Cole turned around. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Hit the like button if you're already feeling something, and drop a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to that diner, because what happened next changed 2 lives in ways neither of them could have imagined. The rain had started around 6 and hadn't stopped since. Cole Maddox pulled into the lot of Patty's Corner Diner at 20 past 8, killed the engine on his 9 pickup, and sat there for a moment longer than he needed to. Through the fogged windshield, the diner's neon sign bled red and pink against the wet asphalt. His hands still had grease under the fingernails. He'd scrubbed them twice before leaving the garage, but grease has a way of finding the places you don't reach. He was hungry in a way that felt personal, not just his stomach, but something deeper, some low-level depletion that had become so familiar over the past 3 years, that he'd stopped noticing it except on nights like this, when he sat alone in a truck in a rain-soaked parking lot and couldn't immediately think of a reason to go inside. He went inside. Patty's was the kind of place that hadn't changed since 1987 and was proud of it. Cracked vinyl booths, laminated menus with pictures of the food, counter with round stools where the regulars sat and talked to whoever was pouring coffee that night. Cole had been coming here twice a week for 2 years, always after closing, always alone, always ordering the same thing, the patty melt with a side of fries and a coffee he'd nurse until the cup was cold. Deb, the evening waitress, spotted him before the bell above the door finished chiming. "Usual?" she called from across the room. "Please," Cole said, and meant it more than she knew. He slid into a booth near the back. Not the very back. He didn't like sitting with his back to a room, but far enough from the door that the draft didn't reach him. Old habits. Some things you stop thinking about and just do. He was pulling out his phone to check Ruby's last text, a picture of the dog wearing one of Cole's work socks on its head, captioned "Don't ask," when he heard the couple. They were 2 tables over. He'd clocked them when he walked in. A man in his early 40s, dressed like he wanted people to notice how well he was dressed, and a woman Cole's age or a little younger, dark-haired, sitting across from him with a posture that had clearly been worked at. Straight spine, hands quiet in her lap. The wheelchair was positioned at the end of the table, partly tucked against the booth, the way you learn to position it so it doesn't become the first thing in the room. Cole hadn't thought anything of it. He'd looked, seen 2 people having dinner, and looked away. That was before the man started talking. It began as something Cole could almost tune out, a low, clipped irritation in the man's voice, the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone they considered slow. Cole caught fragments, mentioned it beforehand, just common courtesy. Not like I'm being unreasonable. The woman across from him said something Cole couldn't hear. Her voice was controlled, careful. Whatever she said, the man didn't like it. "I'm not attacking you," the man said, loudly enough now that the couple at the counter went quiet. "I'm just being honest. This is not what I pictured when you said dinner and drinks." "I didn't picture." He gestured, a short, dismissive wave of his hand toward her wheelchair. "All of this." Cole set his phone face down on the table. He didn't move. He watched the way you learn to watch when you've spent years in situations where moving too fast gets people hurt. Slow assessment. Read the room. Understand what you're looking at before you decide what to do. The woman hadn't flinched. That was the first thing he noticed. Whatever she was feeling, and she was feeling something, he could see it in the set of her jaw, in the way her hands had gone very still. She wasn't letting it reach her face. She was holding herself together with the kind of controlled dignity that takes practice, kind that hurts to maintain. I didn't realize I needed to file a disclosure form before a first date, she said. Her voice was level, almost dry. That's not funny, the man said. I know, neither is this conversation. Cole watched two people at a nearby table exchange a look and then find something fascinating to study on their plates. He watched a teenager near the window hold up a phone and start filming. He watched Deb appear from the kitchen, clock the situation, and slow her steps without quite stopping. He looked at his own table, at the coffee Deb had just poured, at his phone with Ruby's picture still on the screen. He thought, this isn't my problem. He thought, I have enough of my own. He thought, Ruby needs me to come home. He reached for his coffee. You know what your problem is? The man said. He wasn't bothering to keep his voice down anymore. Whether he wanted an audience or had simply stopped caring about one, Cole couldn't tell. You act like the rest of the world is supposed to rearrange itself around you. Like everyone should just accommodate, and when they don't, you act like they're the ones being cruel. I haven't asked you to rearrange anything, the woman said. Still level, still controlled, but something had changed beneath it, some tightness, some pressure building. You're sitting there in that chair acting like I'm the problem. You are the problem, she said quietly. But I'm starting to wonder why I'm still sitting here talking to you about it. Because the man leaned forward, dropping his voice into something that was supposed to sound reasonable but didn't. Honestly, I think you're lonely. I think women in your situation don't have a lot of options. And I think you know that. So you put up with things you shouldn't have to put up with because the alternative is worse. The diner went completely quiet, not the polite quiet of people minding their own business. The held breath quiet of people who have just heard something they can't unhear, who are waiting to see what happens next, who are ashamed of themselves for waiting. Cole tisned some coffee. He sat for a moment with both hands flat on the table. He was thinking about Ruby, who was 8 years old and had already lost her mother and didn't need to lose anything else. He was thinking about the mortgage payment that was 11 days late and the supplier who'd left a message that afternoon that Cole hadn't returned yet because he wasn't ready to hear the answer. He was thinking about how tired he was, how bone deep, bottom of the well tired. Then he thought about what Ruby had said to him 3 weeks ago when they were driving home from school and she'd told him about a boy in her class who'd knocked another kid's lunch off the table and walked away laughing while everyone watched. Why didn't anybody do anything, Dad? He'd told her, sometimes people are scared. Sometimes they don't know what to do. Sometimes they're just waiting for someone else to go first. But what if nobody goes first? Cole stood up. He didn't make a production of it. He didn't push back the chair dramatically or crack his knuckles or take a breath to steady himself. He simply stood up the way he'd stood up 10,000 times before, like a man who has decided something and is now in the process of acting on it. Crossed the diner in 12 steps. He was aware of the watching faces. Kid with the phone. Deb frozen by the coffee station. The couple at the counter who had turned around on their stools. He didn't look at any of them. He walked to the table and stopped beside it. Not looming, not leaning in, just standing there with his arms at his sides and his hands open. The man looked up at him. Cole said nothing for a moment. He just looked at the man with the particular quality of attention that certain people develop when they've spent years in situations where reading another human being correctly is the difference between a bad outcome and a worse one. Not threatening, not aggressive, just present, completely unmistakably present. She doesn't need you to tell her what her options are, Cole said. His voice was conversational, almost quiet, and she doesn't need an audience for the rest of whatever this is. So I'm going to ask you to pay your bill and go. And I'm going to ask you to do it quietly. The man stared at him. Cole watched him process the situation, watched him measure it the way men like this measure things, looking for an angle, looking for a way to come out of it with something intact. Who are you? The man asked. Nobody you need to know, Cole said. A guy who was trying to have a cup of coffee. This is a private. It stopped being private when you raised your voice, Cole said. Still quiet, still conversational. I'm not looking for a problem. I don't think you are either, so let's not make one. Something in the man's calculation shifted. Cole had seen it before, not in places like this, but the principle was the same. There's a moment when a person who has been performing toughness encounters someone for whom toughness is simply a fact, and the performance collapses under the weight of the comparison. The man across the table reached that moment, and Cole watched him reach it, and neither of them said anything about it. The man picked up his jacket from the booth beside him, pulled out his wallet, dropped 2 bills on the table without looking at them, and stood up. He didn't say anything to the woman. He didn't say anything to Cole. He walked to the door, and the bell chimed, and he was gone. The diner exhaled. Cole stood there a moment, alone in the sudden quiet of it, faintly aware that he was now the thing people were looking at. He wasn't uncomfortable with being looked at. He was uncomfortable with being looked at like a hero, which was different. Turned to the woman. She was watching him with an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Not gratitude or not only gratitude. Something more complicated. Assessment, maybe. The same quality of attention he'd been directing at the man, turned now on him. She was striking in a way that had nothing to do with the trappings of it, not striking the way someone curated and presented and photographed is striking, but striking the way a person is when they're entirely themselves, taking up exactly the space they take up and making no apologies for it. Dark hair pulled back, not quite neatly enough to be intentional. A gray blazer over a black top, hands that had gone back to quiet in her lap. Eyes that were, Cole thought, absolutely exhausted with things they weren't going to let exhaust them. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. Are you going to tell me it was nothing? No, Cole said. It was something. It just wasn't complicated. She studied his face for a moment. Then her gaze dropped briefly, not obviously, but he caught it to his hands. The grease that was still under his fingernails, despite 2 rounds of scrubbing. Particular wear of hands that work for a living. What's your name? She asked. Cole. Sit down, Cole. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite an order either. It was something in between the tone of someone who is accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around her decisions, but who was issuing this particular invitation as something more personal than a direction. Cole looked at the empty chair across from her. He thought about his own table, his half-finished coffee, his phone with Ruby's picture on the screen. He sat down. I'm Sloane, she said. Cole Maddox. What do you do, Cole Maddox? I have a garage, auto repair. He paused. 2 bays. It's not, he stopped himself. He'd been about to say it's not much, which was both true and irrelevant. It's mine, he said instead. Something shifted in her expression. Not pity, he'd been braced for pity and was relieved not to find it. Something more like recognition. You came in alone, she said. I usually do. No one waiting at home? My daughter, Cole said. She's probably asleep by now. She texts me updates on the dog until about 8:30, and then she goes quiet. He pulled out his phone, turned it over, showed her the picture of the dog in the sock without quite planning to. The dog belongs to my neighbor technically, but Ruby has decided otherwise. Sloane looked at the picture. Something in her face changed, loosened slightly, like a fist uncurling. She almost smiled. What's the dog's name? Officially, Biscuit. Ruby calls him Sergeant Biscuit on formal occasions. What counts as a formal occasion? Vet appointments. Baths. Cole put the phone away. When he eats something he's not supposed to and has to be talked to seriously about it. She did smile then. It lasted only a moment before something brought it back down. But it had been there, and it was real. And Cole thought it probably looked better on her than she knew. I'm sorry about tonight, he said. Not I'm not sorry I said something. But I'm sorry that it happened. People say that like an apology is the same as it not having happened. I know it's not the same. She looked at him again with that assessing quality. You're not trying to make me feel better. Would it help if I tried? No, she said. It never does. She paused. Most people who do what you did want something from it. They want the gratitude, or they want to feel like a good person, or they want to be able to tell someone the story later. Maybe I'll tell my daughter, Cole said. She asked me a question a few weeks ago. I think this is part of the answer. Sloane was quiet for a moment. Outside, the rain had slowed to something barely there, more mist than rain, softening the light through the windows into something almost gentle. What question did she ask? Cole told her about the boy who knocked the lunch off the table. About Ruby's voice in the car, confused and a little angry, and underneath all of it just genuinely puzzled not by the cruelty, because children understand cruelty, but by the watching, by the not doing. But what if nobody goes first? Sloane listened. She was a very good listener, the kind who doesn't perform listening by nodding constantly, but who simply goes still and lets the other person fill the space. When he finished, she said, What did you tell her? Told her someone always goes first eventually. But you weren't sure you believed it. I wasn't sure I was going to be the one to prove it. Deb appeared at the table with 2 coffees, set them down without being asked, and disappeared again with the practiced invisibility of a good diner waitress who understands when a table needs to be left alone. Cole picked up the cup. It was too hot to drink, but he held it anyway, warming his hands. The garage, Sloane said. Is it doing okay? He considered lying. He was good at the kind of lying that involves not volunteering things, leaving certain facts in the pocket, letting the silence fill in something more manageable than the truth. He'd gotten better at it since Elena died, mostly because the truth had become something that required more energy to carry in public than he usually had. But there was something about this woman, the quality of her attention. Maybe, or the fact that she'd just sat through a humiliation and held herself together with a composure that must have cost her considerably, that made lying feel like the wrong currency. Not great, he said. Not terrible. It's I'm keeping it moving. Forward, I think, most days. Some days I'm just keeping it from going backward. But you're not going to close it? No. Why not? Because Ruby watches me run it, Cole said. She comes in on Saturdays. She knows the names of all the tools. She has a little clipboard she carries around. He paused. She watched her mother get sick and die, and then she watched me. I don't know what she watched me do. Try to hold things together, maybe. Fail at it some. Try again. He stopped himself, not sure he'd meant to say that much. The garage isn't just the garage. It's the thing I'm still standing when I get to the other side of each day. Sloane said nothing, but she was looking at him with an expression he didn't know what to do with, not pity. Not the glassy sympathy people offered at funerals and then retreated from, but something more level and honest than that. Like she was looking at the thing he'd said and finding it true and not uncomfortable with the truth of it. I'm sorry about your wife, she said. Thank you. They sat with that for a moment. The diner had come back to its regular rhythm around them conversations. Silverware, someone laughing at the counter. The held breath quality of earlier had entirely dissolved. Cole checked his watch. I should get back, he said. Ruby wakes up if I'm not there when she checks, of course. Sloane nodded. Thank you, Cole Maddox, for sitting down. Thank you for asking me to. He stood, dropped enough cash on the table to cover both coffees without making anything of it, and picked up his jacket from the booth. He looked at her once more. She was already looking at him. Neither of them said anything else. Cole walked to the door. The bell chimed. The rain outside had stopped while they were talking, and the wet asphalt reflected the streetlights in long, broken ribbons of orange and white. He got into his truck, sat there for a moment. He didn't know her last name. He didn't know anything about her beyond a first name, and the 20 minutes of conversation they'd just had, and the fact that she hadn't thanked him the way people usually thank you, the rushed, slightly embarrassed gratitude of someone who wants the moment to be over. She'd thanked him like she meant it, and then she'd looked at him like he was a person worth looking at. Cole started the truck, pulled out of the lot. He drove home in the quiet, rain-cleaned dark, thinking about his daughter's question, and the diner, and the empty chair. He did not think, I will see her again. But he didn't think, I won't, either. He just drove home, and checked that Ruby was sleeping, and stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment with his hand on the doorframe, watching her breathe. Then he went to bed. And in the morning, he opened the garage at 7, like every other morning, and went to work. 3 days passed. Cole opened the garage at 7 each morning, same as always. He worked through the backlog, a brake job on a minivan, 2 oil changes, a transmission flush on a pickup that had been sitting in the lot since the previous owner ran out of money to finish paying for it. He ordered parts he wasn't sure he could afford. He had the conversation with his supplier about the outstanding balance and came out the other side of it, feeling like he'd been scraped along pavement. He picked Ruby up from school at 3:15, listened to her explain an argument she'd had with her best friend Marisol over who got to be team captain during PE, and concluded diplomatically that both of them had probably been slightly wrong in ways they'd each remember differently. He did not think about the woman from the diner, or he thought about her the way you think about a dream you had not constantly, but in the unguarded moments between things, when you're waiting for a part to heat up, or standing at the sink, washing your hands, and your mind goes somewhere without asking permission first. On the 3rd morning, he was under a 2014 Chevy Tahoe when he heard tires on the cracked asphalt of his parking lot. Not his regular customers, he knew the sounds of their vehicles the way you know voices. This was different, quieter, the kind of engine that didn't announce itself because it didn't need to. He rolled out from under the Tahoe, wiped his hands on the rag tucked into his belt, and squinted against the thin morning light. Car was a black sedan, not new off the lot black, but the kind of black that stays black because someone takes care of it. A driver he didn't recognize was already out and moving toward the rear door. Cole was on his feet by the time the door opened. Sloane Everhart set her hands on the doorframe and shifted herself into the wheelchair, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long since stopped performing the transition for anyone's comfort but her own. She was dressed differently than she'd been at the diner, a structured dark coat, her hair down this time, a leather portfolio across her lap. She looked put together in a way that had edges to it, the kind of professional presentation that was also a kind of armor. Cole stood there with a grease rag in one hand and no coherent response prepared. "You didn't tell me the name of your garage," she said, by way of greeting. "I had to work for it. How'd you find it? You told me your name. You told me you had a two-bay garage." She looked past him at the building, the faded sign, the parking lot with its network of cracks, the second bay with its rolling door that didn't quite close all the way anymore. Her expression was neutral in the way that neutral expressions sometimes aren't. There are only 3 two-bay independent shops in this part of the county. One of them belongs to a man named Gerald who's been semi-retired since 2019. The other one closed. She looked back at him. "That left Maddox Motor Works." Cole said, "You could have called. I don't have your number." "Could have gotten it. Sounds like you're good at finding things." Corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "I wanted to see it." "The garage," she paused. "And I wanted to see you in it." Cole had no answer to that. He looked at her for a moment, then stepped back and gestured toward the open bay. "You want to come in? That's why I'm here." He made space in the narrow office, moving a stack of service orders off the second chair, which he felt immediately self-conscious about, and poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the corner that produced coffee that was functional, if not exactly good. Sloane didn't comment on the coffee. She held the cup in both hands and looked around the office with the same focused attention she'd directed at him the other night, taking inventory without making a performance of it. The office was a small room Cole had mostly stopped seeing because he was in it every day. Whiteboard with the week's jobs. A calendar from an auto parts supplier 2 years out of date that he kept because Ruby had drawn a picture of the dog on the back of it. A framed photo of Ruby on the desk, age 6, in Cole's work jacket that came down to her knees, holding a wrench she couldn't actually use yet, and looking enormously pleased with herself. Sloane looked at the photo. "She's a serious-looking kid," she said. "She takes it on and off. Right now she's in a phase where she thinks things through too much." Cole sat down across from her. "She told you last week she wasn't sure friendship was worth the emotional overhead. Did you tell her?" "I told her she'd been spending too much time with me." Sloane laughed, a real one shorter than it might have been if she'd let it go, but real. She set the cup down on the edge of the desk. "I want to make you a business proposition," she said. Cole had been expecting it. He wasn't sure why something in the way she'd arrived, the portfolio on her lap, the particular quality of intention in how she moved through the world. He'd been expecting it, and he'd been deciding what to say to it since he'd watched her get out of the car. "Before you do," he said, "I want to say something." "All right, what I did the other night at the diner, that wasn't something I did because I expected anything from it. I didn't know who you were. I still don't know who you are, not really. But I don't want what happened there to be the reason for a business conversation, because then the whole thing gets complicated in a way that makes me uncomfortable." Sloane looked at him steadily. "Are you done?" "Mostly." "Good. Because I wasn't going to make you that kind of offer." She opened the portfolio on her lap, but she didn't look at it. She looked at him. "My name is Sloane Everhart. Everhart Dynamics, you've probably heard of it." Cole had heard of it. Everyone in the region had heard of it. The way everyone's heard of a thunderstorm that passed overhead. A while back, you know it happened. You know it was significant. You didn't necessarily track the details. He connected the name to a company. Technology, he thought. Investment. Something that had been in the local news a few years ago when they'd built a new facility outside of town. Vaguely, he said, "We're a technology and investment company. We operate across several sectors, one of which is small business development, not acquisition development. We take positions in businesses we believe in, and we help them grow without hollowing them out." She paused. "I want to make a minority investment in your garage. Operational control stays entirely with you. I don't want to run your business. I want to help it not run out of time." Cole sat with that. Outside, one of his guys, Marcus, who'd been with him for 2 years, and whose last 2 paychecks had been slightly short. Because Cole was robbing Peter to pay, Paul was moving the Tahoe out of the bay to make room for the next job. Cole could hear the engine, the slow grind of the rolling door. "Why?" Cole said. "I told you. Minority investment in—" "Not what? Why? Why this garage? Why me?" Sloane was quiet for a moment. She looked at the photo of Ruby again. When she looked back, something in her expression had shifted, not softer, exactly, but less constructed. "That night at the diner," she said, "there were 11 other people in the room. I counted afterward, the way you do when your mind is trying to process something by converting it into data. 11 people who heard what he was saying. Most of them looked at their plates. 2 of them filmed it." Her voice was even. "You paid your bill. You put your jacket on, you were leaving." "I was," Cole said. "And then you didn't." She looked at him directly. "I've been building a company for 7 years. I've sat across from a lot of people in a lot of rooms, and I've developed a reasonably accurate sense of who people are when they stop performing. When you sat down across from me that night, you weren't performing anything. You were tired and you had somewhere to be, and you did something that cost you something anyway. She paused. That's what I'm investing in. Not the garage, not the square footage or the equipment or the revenue projections. Character of the person running it. Cole looked at the surface of his desk for a moment. There was a coffee ring on it that had been there for so long it had become permanent, a feature rather than a flaw. I'm not a charity case, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know you're not, and I'm not going to pretend the garage is in better shape than it is, because if you've already done the research to find it, you've probably done enough to know roughly what the books look like. I have a general picture, she said. You're carrying debt on the equipment lease. You're behind on a supplier account. Your revenue is stable, but you don't have margin for unexpected costs, which means every unexpected cost becomes a crisis. She said this without judgment, the way a doctor reads a chart, because the facts are more useful than feelings about the facts. You almost lost the building last winter. Cole hadn't told her that, which meant she'd found it. He felt a complicated mixture of things he didn't immediately sort through. Almost, he said, but you didn't, no, because you found a way. Because I got a loan I probably shouldn't have qualified for from a credit union where I know the manager. And I paid it back in 9 months. You paid it back in 9 months, she repeated, as if that detail was the point. Maybe it was. I'm not here to rescue you, Cole. I'm here because I think you're going to make it regardless, and I'd rather help a business like yours survive than watch it close, because you were 2 bad months away from the edge with no runway. Cole was quiet for a longer moment than was probably comfortable. He heard Marcus outside, heard the air compressor cycle on and off, heard a car slow on the road out front, and then continue past. What does minority mean, he said, in concrete terms. Less than 30%. Enough to justify the capital input, not enough to give me any operational authority. She opened the portfolio and turned it toward him. A single page. He expected something dense with legal language and was mildly surprised to find it wasn't. It was a term sheet, simply written, with the key numbers in plain language. Cole read it slowly. He wasn't a fast reader of financial documents, and he didn't pretend otherwise. He read it twice. I want an attorney to look at this, he said. I'd be concerned if you didn't. I don't have an attorney. I can give you 3 names, not mine independent. Choose one. He looked up from the paper. You already have names ready. I assumed you'd want them. He looked at her for a moment. You assumed a lot of things before walking in here. I did research, she said. There's a difference. Assumptions are what you make when you don't bother to find out. Research is what you do when you respect the other person, enough to know what you're talking about before you open your mouth. Cole thought about that. Then he said, you want more coffee? What's in the cup is probably cold. Sure, she said. He got up and refilled both cups. It was a small thing, the refilling of the cups, but it changed the temperature of the room, slightly moved it from negotiation to something adjacent to conversation. He set hers back down in front of her and resumed his seat. Ruby comes in on Saturdays, he said. That's non-negotiable. I don't care what the business structure looks like. She comes in on Saturdays. She has her clipboard. She talks to the customers if she wants to. That's not going to change. Sloane didn't hesitate. That's not something I would ever ask to change. And Marcus, my employee, he's been underpaid for 3 months because I've been juggling. If I take this, the first thing that gets fixed is what I owe him. Write the number down, Sloane said. We'll make it part of the initial disbursement. Cole wrote the number on the back of a service order and slid it across the desk. Sloane looked at it, noted it on her copy of the term sheet, and slid the paper back. Okay, Cole said. Okay, you'll consider it. Or, okay, I'll have an attorney look at it this week. And if it says what it looks like it says, then okay. Something in Sloane's expression settled not relief, exactly, but a kind of quiet satisfaction, the look of a person who'd made a bet and was reasonably confident they'd bet well. She closed the portfolio. I should let you get back to work, she said. I should get back to work, he agreed. He stood when she moved toward the door, not because protocol required it, but because it was what you did. He walked her out to the parking lot, into the thin winter light, where her driver was waiting beside the black sedan. At the edge of the lot, Sloane stopped. Cole, yeah. The offer isn't contingent on the diner. I need you to understand that. If I'd found this garage some other way through a referral, through a business contact, and the numbers looked the same, and the person running it had the same track record, I'd be making the same conversation. But you found it because of the diner. Yes. Then it's not contingent on it, he said. I'm not saying that to be difficult. I just think it's more honest to say what it is. Considered that. Fair enough, she said. It's both things. Character in the business. I can live with both things, Cole said. She nodded once, got into the car with the same practiced efficiency. The driver closed the door, and Cole stood in the parking lot until the sedan had turned out onto the road and disappeared. Marcus appeared from the bay behind him, wiping his hands on a rag. Who was that? Marcus asked. Someone interested in the business, Cole said. Marcus looked at the road where the sedan had been. That's a serious car for someone just interested. Let's get back to the Tahoe, Cole said. But he stood there for another moment before he followed Marcus inside, looking at the road, at the cracked lot, the faded sign above the bay doors. Maddox Motor Works. He'd named it that because it was what he had his name in the work. He hadn't been trying to be memorable. He'd just been trying to be accurate. He went back inside. That week he called one of the attorneys on Sloane's list, a woman named Patricia Nguyen, whose office was in a building downtown with no framed inspirational quotes on the walls, which Cole took as a good sign. He sat across from her for 45 minutes while she read the term sheet in a way that made it clear she was actually reading it and not just performing the reading of it. It's clean, she said when she finished. What do you mean by clean? I mean, there's no language in here that gives the investor any authority to override operational decisions. No buyout clause triggered by missed revenue targets. No board seat. She set the pages down. Whoever drafted this was trying to make it simple. Sometimes people make things simple because they're hiding something in the simplicity. In this case, I don't think so. The terms say what they say. So you'd sign it? I'd have 3 questions answered first. She listed them. Cole called Sloane that afternoon. He had her number. Now. Exchanged in the parking lot as she was leaving, and she answered the questions in 11 minutes without checking anything, which told him she'd expected the questions and had decided on the answers before the call. He signed the term sheet the following Thursday. The effect was not immediate. Real things rarely are. But in the weeks that followed, the garage began to breathe differently. New diagnostic equipment arrived that Cole had been trying to justify for 2 years, and couldn't the kind that let him find problems faster and charge for the finding, which was the part of the business he'd never been good at monetizing, because it felt strange to charge for looking when customers expected you to charge for fixing. Marcus received a check that covered what he was owed with enough extra that he came to find Cole in the bay and stood there for a moment without saying anything, which was its own kind of communication. The foreclosure notice that had been sitting in Cole's desk drawer, the one he'd been managing but not eliminating, the one he looked at occasionally the way you press a bruise to check if it still hurts, was resolved in full by the end of the following month. He didn't tell Ruby about the money. She was 8, and 8-year-olds don't need balance sheets. But she noticed things in the way children notice things when they've been paying close attention to the adults all around them for years. The way their survival has depended on reading the adults around them correctly. She noticed that her father didn't sit at the kitchen table after he thought she was asleep anymore, bent over papers with that particular quality of stillness that was not really stillness, but was worry held very still. She noticed that one Saturday morning Cole didn't check his phone 3 times during breakfast. She didn't say anything about it. She just ate her cereal and told him about a book she was reading. And when he laughed at something she said, she laughed too. And neither of them pointed at the laughter, like it was remarkable, but it was there. Cole and Sloane spoke on the phone twice a week, and the conversations were mostly practical vendor questions, equipment decisions, a marketing idea that a consultant Sloane knew had suggested, and that Cole rejected because it felt like it would change the character of the place without adding anything that mattered. Sloane didn't push back. She listened to his reasoning and said okay, and moved on, which he appreciated more than he told her. Once, during one of those calls, there was a pause that lasted slightly longer than a pause about vendor questions usually lasts. "How's Ruby?" Sloane asked. "She's good. She's decided Sergeant Biscuit needs obedience training, so she's been watching videos online and practicing commands. The dog finds the whole thing amusing. Has it worked?" "He sits now, but only if she says please." Sloane said, "Smart dog. Smarter than he looks. Looks like a throw pillow that got loose." She laughed again, the same kind of laugh as in the garage, shorter than it wanted to be but real. "What about you?" Cole asked. "What about me? How are you doing?" "Generally." A pause. "I'm busy. Busy is good. Busy keeps you stopped." "I'm fine, Cole." He thought she might be telling the truth, and he thought she might also be telling him the most convenient version of it. He didn't push. He knew what it was to give the short answers, because the long answer required more than you had at that moment. "Okay," he said. "Let me know if the equipment supplier doesn't come through by Friday." "I will," she said. "Good night." Good night." He set the phone down on the kitchen counter. The house was quiet, Ruby asleep. The dog allegedly asleep at the foot of her bed, though Cole suspected he migrated to the couch the moment the bedroom door was closed. Kitchen light was on, a circle of yellow in the dark house, and for a moment Cole just stood in it without needing to do anything. He noticed he was not worried. The noticing surprised him more than the feeling itself. He'd been worried for so long, the specific, low-grade, perpetual worry of a man trying to keep too many things from falling at once, that the absence of it had its own texture. Like the silence after a machine cuts off that you didn't realize was running until it stops. He turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and that was when everything went wrong. Started small enough that Cole almost missed it. Plier he'd worked with for 4 years called on a Tuesday morning to say they were restructuring their client list and would need to discontinue his account. The explanation was vague in the particular way that explanations are vague when the real reason is something the person doesn't want to say out loud. Cole pressed, politely. The representative on the other end grew vaguer. Cole thanked him and hung up. He called the next supplier on his list and placed an order. 20 minutes later, the order came back, declined not for credit reasons, but with a note that they were no longer accepting new accounts in his region. He was a not new account. He'd been buying from them for 18 months. He called to clarify. The person who answered couldn't explain it. The week after that, an inspector showed up unannounced. Cole's paperwork was in order. He ran a clean shop, had never failed an inspection, but the inspector moved through the garage with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he was looking for something specific. He found nothing, noted minor procedural items that would have been non-issues in any routine inspection, and left without explaining what had prompted the visit. Then a customer came in, a woman named Patricia Dole, who'd been bringing her Subaru to Cole for 2 years. And while Cole was doing her intake, she mentioned, almost apologetically, that she'd received a text message from an unknown number the previous week. The message said that Maddox Motor Works had been sold to a corporate investment group and would be raising prices by 30%. I didn't believe it. Patricia said, but my neighbor got the same message, and she thought. It's not true, Cole said. Nothing's been sold. This is still my garage. I know that now. I just wanted to mention it. He mentioned it to Marcus after she left. Marcus was quiet for a moment, the way Marcus was quiet when he was thinking, rather than when he had nothing to say. Third one this week, Marcus said. Third customer who mentioned it. Third customer who mentioned getting a message. The Garza family, the guy with the diesel truck. Peterson, yeah, and now her. Marcus looked at the floor, then back at Cole. That's not a mistake, boss. Somebody's doing that on purpose. Cole stood in the bay for a long moment. He was thinking. He wasn't letting himself feel anything in particular, yet the feeling could come later, when he understood what he was looking at. Right now he was just taking in data. He called Sloane that evening. He told her about the suppliers, the inspector, the messages. She didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice had a quality Cole hadn't heard in it before, a particular kind of controlled recognition, like someone who has just received confirmation of something they were hoping they were wrong about. Cole, she said carefully, I need you to be honest with me about something. All right, before we go further with this, before I tell you what I think is happening, I need to know that you're not going to disappear on me. That you're not going to hear what I'm about to say and decide the whole thing is too complicated and walk away from the partnership. Cole was quiet for a moment. I don't walk away from things, he said. She seemed to accept that. I think this is Warren Blackridge. The name meant nothing to Cole. He said so. Warren Blackridge runs a company called Blackridge Automotive Group. He has interests in 12 cities, 2 of which directly compete with Everhart Dynamics Ventures. He has been trying to undermine or acquire those ventures for 3 years, by any means that stay technically on the right side of legal. Her voice was even, measured, but underneath it was something that sounded like old exhaustion. The exhaustion of having fought something for a long time. He's been looking for a pressure point, something he could use to force my hand. She paused. Think he found your garage. Cole absorbed that. He's not going after you, he said slowly. He's going after you through me. Through you, through your livelihood, through your reputation. She paused again. Through your daughter's perception of you in your community. Cole said nothing. Cole, I heard you, he said. His voice was steady, flatter than it usually was, in the way that voices go flat when they're being held very carefully. I'm sorry, Sloane said. I didn't anticipate this. I should have considered. Did you know he'd do this? No, I knew he was watching my business interests. I didn't anticipate he'd move this quickly or target this specifically. Cole sat with the phone in his hand and looked at the wall of his garage office. Ruby had taped a drawing there 2 weeks ago, a picture of the garage, with Cole standing in front of it, and Sergeant Biscuit in the parking lot, and a sun in the corner that was orange instead of yellow because, as Ruby had explained, the yellow crayon was broken. He looked at that picture. He thought about the inspector walking through his shop with his clipboard, the customers getting text messages, Marcus's face when he told him. He thought about a career he'd spent years in that had taught him, above everything else, that the worst thing you can do when someone applies pressure is make decisions based on the pressure rather than the situation. Pressure is a tactic. The situation is the thing that's actually true. The situation right now was that someone had decided Cole Maddox was a soft target, a mechanic with a struggling business and a kid to support, and no resources to fight back with. They didn't know what Cole used to be. They didn't know, and he'd spent 3 years being glad they didn't, and now that gladness had a different shape. "What do you need from me?" he said. Sloane was quiet for a beat. "What? To fight this? What do you need from me?" Another pause longer. "I have investigators working on the financial side. But the documentation on the ground, the inspections, the supplier calls, the pattern, I need eyes inside the garage. Someone who can track what's happening, log it carefully, build a record that holds up. I can do that." "Cole, I'm not asking you to, I know you're not," he said. "I'm telling you I can do it. I can log the inspections, the dates, the names. I have security cameras. I installed 2 years ago. I've been meaning to upgrade them, but I didn't have the budget. And now I'm glad I didn't. Because the old system archives locally, which means nobody can pull the footage remotely." He paused. "I spent 11 years learning how to pay attention to details in environments that didn't want me paying attention. I think I can manage a parking lot and a diner and the occasional suspicious vehicle." Sloane was quiet for a moment that felt different from the other quiet moments in the conversation. 11 years, she said. "You told me you'd been in the military." "You didn't tell me Navy," he said. "I was a SEAL." He could hear her breathing, slow and even, while she processed that. "You never mentioned it," she said. "It's not usually relevant. But right now it means I know how to observe, document, and stay calm while someone is trying to convince me that my situation is worse than it is." He looked at the drawing on the wall. Ruby's orange sun. "Which it's not, it's bad. But I've been in bad before." Sloane said, "So have I." They both left that sitting between them for a moment. "Okay," she said finally. "Here's what we do." Cole picked up a pen in the back of an old service order, and he listened. Outside the office window, the garage lot was dark and quiet. The sign was off. The bay doors were closed. Everything looked exactly as it had every other night. For the past 2 years, a small business closed for the evening. Nothing remarkable about it. Nothing that would tell a stranger anything except that a man worked here and had gone home to his daughter. But Cole sat in the office with a pen in his hand and a phone at his ear, and for the first time in 3 years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten the shape of. Not fear, not anger, clarity. The exhausted mechanic had spent 3 years finding his footing, and Warren Blackridge, whoever he was, whatever he thought he knew about Cole Maddox, had just reminded him of something important. The footing was found, and Cole Maddox, when he planted his feet, did not move. Cole started keeping a notebook, not a digital file, not a shared document, a physical notebook, the kind with a black cover and lined pages, the kind that couldn't be remotely accessed or accidentally synced or subpoenaed without someone first having to physically find it. Kept it in the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath a service manual for a diesel engine that nobody had opened since 2021. Old habit. When you've operated in environments where information is the difference between an outcome and a catastrophe, you develop opinions about where you store things and who can reach them. Every inspection got logged. Date, time, name of the inspector if they offered one, which department they claimed to represent, what they looked at, what they cited, what they didn't cite. Every supplier call that went sideways got its own entry company name, the name of the person on the line if he could get it, the exact language they used to decline him, because language reveals things when you read it carefully enough. Every customer who mentioned receiving a strange message got noted. He didn't pump them for information, he just listened, let them tell it in their own words, thanked them for mentioning it, and wrote it down that evening. He upgraded the security cameras 2 weeks after his conversation with Sloane, using a portion of the investment that he'd originally earmarked for a tire balancing machine. He bought a system with 4 exterior cameras that covered the lot from different angles, 1 interior camera over the office door, and a separate hard drive that archived continuously and backed up to an encrypted drive he kept at home. He installed all of it himself on a Sunday morning while Ruby was at Marisol's house, working through the instruction manual with the same methodical patience he applied to engines he'd never seen before reading first. Understanding the system, then doing. When Marcus came in Monday morning and noticed the cameras, he looked at Cole with the particular expression of a man who has been paying close enough attention to know that something is being addressed without being told what it is. New hardware, Marcus said. Overdue, Cole said. Marcus nodded and went to start the coffee. He didn't ask, and Cole didn't explain. They had developed, over 2 years of working together in a small space, the kind of functional shorthand that saves energy. Marcus understood that if Cole wanted him to know something, Cole would tell him, and that Cole not telling him yet was not the same as Cole not trusting him. Cole told him 3 days later. He sat him down in the office after they'd locked up, with 2 cups of coffee and no particular preamble. "I want you to know what's happening," Cole said. "Not because you need to do anything differently, but because you deserve to understand what's going on in your own workplace." Marcus listened to the whole thing without interrupting. He was a big, quiet man in his late 30s who had grown up in a family where everyone talked over each other at the dinner table and had responded by becoming someone who waited until the other person was actually finished. When Cole was done, Marcus was quiet for a moment. "This Blackridge guy," Marcus said. "He's doing this because of Sloane Everhart?" "Because of the partnership, yeah. And he thought targeting you was the way to get to her. That's what it looks like." Marcus turned his coffee cup in his hands. "He doesn't know you very well." "No," Cole said, "he doesn't." Marcus looked up. "What do you need me to do?" "Keep working. Keep being exactly who you are with the customers. If anything unusual happens, someone you don't recognize asking questions, another inspection, anything that feels off, you tell me immediately, and you don't discuss it with anyone outside this room." "Done," Marcus said. He finished his coffee, stood up, rinsed the cup in the utility sink, set it on the drying rack. He stopped at the office door. "Cole, the paycheck thing, the last few months I knew something was wrong. I didn't say anything because I could see you were managing it. Told you sooner. Maybe, but you fixed it." Marcus shrugged a small, genuine gesture. "That's the part that matters." He went home. Cole sat in the empty office for a few minutes, listening to the garage settle into its nighttime sounds, the tick of cooling metal, the distant traffic on the road outside. He thought, this is worth fighting for, not as an abstract proposition, as a specific, concrete truth that he could point at the office, the bay, the notebook in the bottom drawer, the man who just rinsed his coffee cup and set it on the drying rack because he'd been here long enough to know where things went. He drove home, made dinner, helped Ruby with a book report on a biography of a woman she'd chosen because, Ruby explained, she'd had an interesting hat in the picture on the cover, which was not exactly the recommended methodology for choosing historical subjects, but had apparently led her to someone genuinely worth reading about. Cole didn't argue with the process. He put her to bed at 9. Checked the garage camera feeds remotely from his phone, a feature he'd specifically requested from the installation technician, the ability to pull up the feeds from anywhere. The lot was empty, the bay doors dark, everything still. He went to sleep. 3 weeks into the documentation process, something broke differently than the previous things had. Cole was in the office at 7:15 on a Wednesday morning, before Marcus arrived, going through the previous day's invoices, when he noticed the desk drawer was not quite the way he'd left it. He noticed because he was someone who left things a specific way, not obsessively, not in the neat freak sense, but in the trained sense of a person who has spent years in environments where the position of objects relative to each other carries information. The service manual that sat on top of the notebook, the way he'd placed it. It was off by about 2 inches and rotated slightly, the way something gets rotated when it's been picked up and put back by someone who wasn't certain of the exact original placement. Cole stood very still. He looked at the desk. The rest of it appeared undisturbed, but the desk was the place that mattered. The desk was where the invoices were, where the business records were kept in the physical accordion folder that he hadn't yet converted to digital because he kept meaning to and hadn't. He opened the accordion folder and went through it slowly, section by section. Nothing was missing. He was almost certain of that. But several sections had been disturbed, not dramatically, not in a way a casual observer would catch, but the papers within each section were not in the order he maintained them. Kept service records chronologically within each customer's section, oldest in the back. Several sections had papers where the order had been disrupted and then restored, but not perfectly. Someone had been through his records, not stolen them, photographed them, most likely. photographed specific documents, and then returned everything to a version of its original state that was close enough to fool most people. Cole was not most people. He pulled up the security footage from the previous night on his phone. He'd checked at 11. Before going to bed, the lot had been empty. He started the playback from 11:15 and watched at 4 times speed the grainy nighttime footage of an empty parking lot scrolling forward in time. 2:47 in the morning, a vehicle turned into the lot without headlights. Cole slowed the playback to normal speed. The vehicle was a dark-colored sedan, impossible to identify definitively in the night vision footage, but he could see the general shape midsize, American or Japanese make, nothing distinctive about it, except the absence of headlights, which was itself distinctive. Parked at the far edge of the lot, at the margin of what the camera could resolve, as if whoever was driving had some knowledge of where the cameras were, but not complete knowledge, because Cole had placed one camera specifically to cover the blind spots that a person casing the building from the outside would assume existed. An old principle: when someone scouts your position, they look for what they can see and plan around what they can't. They rarely account for the possibility that you've already thought about what they'll assume they can't see. The sedan sat in the lot for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Then 2 figures got out. The footage wasn't good enough to resolve faces at that distance, but Cole could see body types, movement patterns, the general shape of the operation: one person who remained near the vehicle, one who moved toward the building. The building had been locked. Cole checked the doors every night before leaving: front door, side entrance, office window. He walked through the footage in his memory and checked it against what he was seeing now. The second figure moving to the side entrance, and then Cole leaned forward, watching and then being inside. The side entrance had a lock that Cole had been meaning to upgrade for a year. Standard pin tumbler that someone with moderate skill could work through in under 2 minutes. He'd been meaning to replace it with a deadbolt with a reinforced strike plate. He had not gotten around to it. He noted the timestamps. He noted the direction the sedan had come from. He noted which way it had turned when it left, 6 minutes and 40 seconds after arriving. Then he called Sloane. It was 6:50 in the morning. She answered on the second ring, which told him that she was already awake, or that his number had been moved into a category on her phone that bypassed the usual filters. "Someone got into the garage last night," he said. Pause. Short, but he caught it. "What was taken?" "Nothing, as far as I can tell. But my business records were gone through. Someone photographed documents." He paused. "I have them on camera. Not clearly enough to identify, but enough to establish that it happened, what time, and the direction of travel when they left." He heard her breathing, controlled and steady. "Cole," she said, "I need you to not touch anything else in that office today until I can get someone there to look at it. I've already been in the office, I know, going forward. You want to send someone to process the scene. I have an investigator who does this specifically. She's good. She won't disrupt your business." A pause. "Are you okay?" He thought about the question. He was standing in the office, where someone had been at 2:47 in the morning, going through his files, and the most honest answer to how he felt about it was not okay in the way a normal person would be not okay, not frightened, not violated in that particular domestic way of finding your private space disturbed. What he felt was something older and more focused, a quality of attention that narrowed everything unnecessary out of the frame. "I'm fine," he said. "Send your person." The investigator arrived by 9. Her name was Dana Reyes. Compact and matter-of-fact, with a kind of methodical presence that Cole immediately respected, she came in, assessed the room, asked 3 questions, and then worked without narrating what she was doing. She dusted the drawer surfaces, the accordion folder tabs, the service manual. She pulled the security footage onto a drive she brought herself. She photographed the room from multiple angles. When she was done, she looked at Cole with the honest expression of someone delivering a useful truth. "Whoever did this knew what they were looking for," she said. "They went through your invoicing records, your supplier contracts, and your business bank statements. That's a specific list. That's not someone fishing. That's someone who already had a theory and was looking for evidence to support it." "What kind of theory?" Cole asked. "The kind that asks whether your business finances look like someone being secretly controlled by outside money." She looked at him steadily. They were looking for irregularities they could use. Something that would look bad taken out of context. "And did they find any?" Dana paused. "The minority investment from Everhart Dynamics is documented in your records. It's a legal investment with a signed agreement. I know that. They would know that. But legal documents can be misrepresented to people who don't have the time or inclination to read them carefully. She looked at the office, then back at him. They're building a narrative. They need material to build it from. Cole understood narrative. He understood it in the specific, applied way of someone who had operated in environments where the story you tell about a situation can determine the outcome of the situation as much as the facts themselves. Warren Blackridge wasn't trying to prove something true. He was trying to construct something convincing. The newspaper story came out 11 days later. Cole found out about it from Ruby. She came home from school on a Thursday afternoon with a quality of silence about her that was different from her normal quiet, not the thinking quiet or the tired quiet, but something with edges to it, something she was carrying carefully. She set her backpack down. She sat at the kitchen table while Cole was making dinner. She said nothing for long enough that he turned from the stove to look at her. "What happened?" he said. She looked at him with the expression she made when she was working up to something. Jalen's mom said something at pickup. Cole turned the burner down. "What did she say?" She was talking to another mom. "I don't think she knew I was close enough to hear." Ruby looked at her hands. She said, "Your garage isn't really yours anymore. That you sold it and you're just pretending to still run it. And that people were saying you've been—" She stopped, taking money that wasn't yours. The kitchen was very quiet. Cole moved from the stove to the table and sat down across from his daughter. Ruby was 8 years old, and she was looking at him with the eyes of someone older, someone who had been processing something painful all afternoon and had been waiting to see what he would do with it. "Look at me," Cole said. She looked at him. "The garage is mine. The records are clean. I made a business arrangement with an investor who is a partner, not an owner, and all of it is documented and legal and above board." He said it simply, without anger, without the defensive over-explanation that tells a child more about the adult's anxiety than the actual facts. "Someone is trying to damage my business by spreading lies about it. I'm dealing with it. That's the truth." Ruby was quiet for a moment. "Who's doing it?" she asked. "A man who thinks hurting me will hurt someone else he's trying to hurt." She frowned. "That doesn't make any sense." "It makes sense to him," Cole said. "It's a bad strategy, but he's committed to it." She chewed on that. "Are you going to be okay?" "Yes." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." He paused. "But I want you to tell me if you hear anything else like that. Not because it changes anything, but because I don't want you carrying it by yourself." She nodded. In the specific way, she nodded when she was genuinely accepting something rather than just acknowledging it. "Then what's for dinner, pasta?" "Kind with the stuff in it?" "The kind with the stuff in it." She went to wash her hands, and Cole went back to the stove, and his jaw was tight for the rest of the evening. But he didn't let it reach anything she could see. The newspaper article had run in the regional business section that morning. Cole read it that night after Ruby was in bed, on the kitchen table, with his coffee going cold beside him, reading it the way you read something you're trying to fact-check in real time, not absorbing it as written, but tracking each claim against what he actually knew to be true. It was a piece of work, in the way that well-constructed lies are a piece of work, technically sparse on anything provable as false. It described Maddox Motor Works as a struggling business that had received what it called significant outside investment from a company described as having complex financial relationships with multiple regional entities. It used phrases like "questions have been raised," and sources close to the situation indicate without identifying any source or specifying what question had been raised by whom. It described Cole, without naming him by name but making the identification obvious to anyone who knew the garage, as a businessman who had received outside investment under arrangements that some community members found difficult to reconcile with his public statements. It was the kind of article that couldn't be easily sued over because it never quite said a specific false thing. It simply arranged true facts and vague insinuations in a structure that implied something damning without committing to the implication. Cole read it twice, then he folded the paper and put it in the bottom drawer with the notebook. He sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. What he was feeling now was not the focused clarity he'd felt when he found the disturbed office. That had been clean a problem with a shape, an adversary behaving in ways he could understand and respond to. This was something uglier and harder to address, because it was aimed not at his business or his finances, but at how people saw him in the place where he lived and worked and raised his daughter. In the days that followed, Cole felt the shift in the neighborhood, the way you feel a change in air pressure, not dramatically, not all at once, but as a cumulative difference in small things. The mechanic down the street who used to wave when Cole drove past didn't wave. 2 families pulled their vehicles from his service schedule without explanation. Parent at school pickup looked past Cole in a way that was just different enough from the usual distant politeness to carry meaning. Some people called. Tom Gruber, who'd been bringing his family's vehicles to Cole for 18 months, called specifically to say that he'd read the article and considered the source and wasn't changing anything. Patricia Dole, the Subaru woman, stopped by the garage in person to say essentially the same thing, with more pointed language about the publication in question. Cole thanked them. He didn't perform gratitude, he simply said thank you and meant it and moved on. But the weight of it accumulated. He felt it in the way the day started, in that first moment of awareness, before he was entirely awake, when he lay in the quiet of the bedroom and the day's problems assembled themselves in the order they'd be waiting for him. He also felt it in the garage itself, in the particular quality of work that becomes both harder and more necessary when everything around it is being questioned. He worked. He showed up every morning at 7. He did the jobs that came in fewer of them now than a month ago, but enough to keep Marcus working and the doors open, and he did them as well as he knew how, which was well, because even in the middle of everything else, Cole Maddox was still a good mechanic. Sloane's investigators, meanwhile, had been building a parallel structure. She called Cole on a Friday evening with an update, and her voice had a quality he'd learned to recognize: a tightening, a careful management of something that was not quite anger, but was not far from it. "We have the shell corporations," she said. 3 layers of them, but the through line is clear. The PR company that planted the newspaper story receives payments from a holding company that traces back to a subsidiary of Blackridge Automotive Group. "That's a connection," Cole said. "Is it a provable connection?" "Documentable. The payment trails exist. Whether a court finds them sufficient depends on—" "I'm not asking about court," Cole said. "I'm asking about the hearing." 2 days earlier, a notice had arrived. A formal community business hearing had been scheduled at City Hall, a mechanism that existed for exactly this kind of situation. Ostensibly, to allow community members to weigh in on business practices that affected the neighborhood. The notice was neutral in its language, as such notices always are, but it was not neutral in its function. Someone had filed a petition requesting the hearing, and the petition was signed by 12 names, none of which Cole recognized. Sloane had recognized 3 of them. "Warren will be there," she said. "I assumed. He'll bring attorneys. He'll have documentation prepared. I'd bet he's had someone preparing testimony from those 12 names. And what will you have?" A pause. "Everything I just described. The shell corporations, the payment trails, the communication records that show coordinated pressure on your suppliers." Another pause. "And whatever you have." Cole looked at the notebook on his desk, the footage logs, the dates and times and vehicle directions. The record of 6 weeks of careful, patient observation conducted by a man who had spent 11 years learning how to pay attention to things that didn't want to be paid attention to. "I have enough," he said, Cole. Her voice shifted slightly. "I want to talk about how you should present at the hearing. All right? You could disclose your military record, your SEAL background. It would immediately reframe how people in that room see you. You're not a mechanic who got in over his head. You're a decorated veteran who—" "No," Cole said, a pause. "Just hear me out. I heard you out." "No, I'm not using that." He said it without heat, without apology. "That's not the card I'm playing." "Why not?" "It's true. It's who you are." "It's who I was," Cole said. "And the reason I'm not using it is because it shouldn't matter. The question at that hearing is whether my business is honest and whether I've been targeted by a coordinated campaign. That question doesn't change based on what I did before I owned the garage. It changes how people receive you. I know that. And I don't want to win that way." He was quiet for a moment. "If I walk in there and say, 'Look at my record, look at what I did,' that's me asking them to trust me because of what I've been. I want them to trust me because of what I can show them." Sloane was silent. "I know that's not the most strategic position," Cole said. "It's not," she said quietly, "but I understand it." The week before the hearing, Warren Blackridge escalated once more. A man Cole didn't recognize came into the garage on a Tuesday afternoon. With a vehicle that didn't need service, Cole could see that immediately. The car was in fine condition. The story about a strange noise didn't hold up against the first 30 seconds of listening. The man was there to look at the garage, at the equipment, at Cole himself. He was doing what Cole had been doing on the other side, building a picture. Cole gave him a tour. He did it deliberately, walking the man through both bays, the office, the lot, answering every question with the specific patience of someone who has nothing to hide and understands that demonstrating that fact is itself a kind of communication. He pointed out the new equipment. He showed him the inspection records on the wall. He talked about Marcus, about the customers, about the kind of work the garage specialized in. The man left without having found whatever he'd come looking for. Cole noted the vehicle in the notebook. Plate number, make, model, time of arrival and departure, direction of travel. He pulled the camera footage that evening and captured a clear, still image of the vehicle in the lot. 2 days later, he matched the plate to a vehicle registered to a private security consultancy that, through a company search Sloane's investigators ran, had billed Blackridge Automotive Group for services in the previous fiscal year. Cole added it to the record. He was building a wall, brick by brick, laid in the specific order that would make it impossible to dismantle once the mortar set. The night before the hearing, he sat in Ruby's room after she was asleep. He did this occasionally, not often, not in a way that would worry her if she woke and found him there, but sometimes, when the day had been heavy enough that he needed to locate himself in something real before he could sleep. Ruby's room was a comfortable mess, books on the floor beside the bed, because she moved them there when she was done reading, so she wouldn't have to get up in the morning if she wanted to start a different one. Poster of a marine biologist she'd gotten interested in after a school field trip. Drawings on the desk, and Sergeant Biscuit, who had absolutely migrated from the foot of the bed to the space between Ruby and the wall, and who opened one eye when Cole came in and then closed it again with the air of a creature who had found his optimal position and seen no reason to adjust it. Cole sat in the chair by the window for a while. He thought about the hearing tomorrow, about Warren Blackridge and his attorneys and his prepared testimony and his 12 petition names. He thought about Sloane and her investigators and her financial documentation. He thought about his notebook and his camera footage and the quiet 6 weeks of watching and recording. He thought about Ruby asking, "Are you going to be okay?" He thought about his own answer, "I'm sure." He had not been entirely sure when he said it. But sitting in the chair in his daughter's room, in the dark and the quiet, he was becoming more sure by the degree. Not because he was certain the hearing would go the way he needed it to go. He'd been in enough situations to know that preparation doesn't guarantee outcome, it only shifts the odds. And odds aren't certainties. Plenty of people prepared carefully and still lost. But he was sure of this. Whatever happened tomorrow, it would not be because he had failed to pay attention. It would not be because he had panicked or cut corners or let the pressure convince him to be someone he wasn't. He had done the work. He had kept showing up at 7, done the jobs, paid his employee, maintained his records, protected his daughter from as much of it as he could while still being honest with her about what was real. That was the life he'd built, and it was still standing. He looked at Ruby asleep in the dim room, her face completely relaxed in the particular way children's faces relax when they're deeply under, all the thinking and arguing and complicated navigating of the day wiped clean. He thought about what he was going to say in that hearing room tomorrow. Not the military record, not the dramatic reveal of what the exhausted mechanic had once been. Just the truth of the diner, and the truth of the garage, and the truth of the past 6 weeks, laid out in a sequence that meant something. Sometimes the strongest thing you can bring into a room is the simple, complete, documented truth. Cole stood up quietly, picked up a book from the floor that had migrated into the walking path, and placed it on the desk. Scratched Sergeant Biscuit once behind the ear, the dog didn't open his eyes, just moved one paw slightly, acknowledging the contact without committing to wakefulness. Cole went to bed. In the morning, he put on a clean work shirt, the best one he owned, that was still a work shirt, and drove to City Hall. He arrived before Warren Blackridge. He sat in the front row and opened his notebook on his knee, and he waited, and he was not afraid. City Hall at 9 in the morning had the specific smell of old carpet and recycled air that public buildings accumulate over decades of use, not unpleasant exactly. Just institutional, the smell of a place where things get decided by committee. The hearing room was on the second floor, a rectangular space with rows of folding chairs facing a long table where the board would sit, and a podium positioned between the audience and the board like a small island in the middle of contested water. Cole had arrived at 8:45. He'd sat in the front row with his notebook on his knee and watched the room fill. Some faces he recognized: neighbors, a few former customers, 2 business owners from the same street as the garage. Some he didn't. A local reporter he'd seen before at a community zoning meeting had set up near the side wall with a notepad and the particular posture of someone who had been tipped off that this morning would be worth attending. Warren Blackridge arrived at 8:58, which told Cole something about the man before he'd said a word. 2 minutes before the scheduled, start late enough to make an entrance, early enough to claim punctuality. He came in with 3 people behind him, Two attorneys Cole recognized as attorneys by the way they carried their briefcases, and a younger man who moved like an assistant and spent the first 30 seconds scanning the room and making notes on a tablet. Warren himself was in his mid-60s, heavy-set in the way of a man who'd been athletic once and had redirected that physicality into something more stationary over the years. Expensive suit. The kind of easy authority that comes from being the most powerful person in most rooms you walk into for long enough that you stop checking whether you're still the most powerful person. He looked at Cole once when he entered. Cole looked back. Neither of them nodded. Sloane arrived 3 minutes later, which Cole had not expected. They hadn't discussed her attending, and he found himself recalibrating something in his chest, not relief exactly, but a steadying, the way a load-bearing wall takes weight. She positioned her wheelchair at the end of the front row, 2 seats from Cole. She had a laptop open on her lap and a leather satchel hooked over the back of the chair. She looked at Cole, and he looked at her, and she gave him a single, small nod that said, "I have what we need." He gave her the same nod back. The 7 board members filed in at 9 sharp and took their seats at the long table. The chair was a woman named Margaret Oakes Cole, had looked her up the previous evening, a retired city planner in her mid-60s, who had chaired this particular board for 9 years, and who had a reputation, according to the 3 separate people Cole had asked about her, for running meetings that were orderly without being theatrical, which was either encouraging or a problem, depending on what you were bringing to the room. Margaret Oakes gavelled the hearing to order, read the procedural statement that explained what the hearing was and wasn't, and introduced the item. Then she looked up. "We'll hear first from the party who requested the hearing," she said. Warren Blackridge stood. He spoke for 18 minutes. Cole counted. It was a polished performance. Cole gave him that. Warren spoke about community business standards, about the importance of transparency in local commerce, about the obligation of established businesses to operate with integrity toward their customers and neighbors. He spoke about the business community as an ecosystem that depended on trust. He spoke about his own long involvement in regional economic development, which he described in terms that made it sound like civic service rather than market expansion. Then he got to Cole. He didn't call him dishonest. That would have been too specific, too easy to refute. Instead, he spoke about businesses that accept outside investment without full disclosure to their customer base, about the potential for conflicts of interest when a small business becomes financially dependent on a larger corporate entity, about the importance of ensuring that local independent businesses remain genuinely independent. He held up a copy of the newspaper article, not to read from it, just to establish its existence as a document in the room, and said that the questions it raised were exactly the kind of questions this board existed to address. He cited 4 of the 12 petition signatories by name and summarized what they claimed to have experienced or observed. Kept his tone measured, concerned, civic-minded. He sat down to the sound of a room that had absorbed everything he'd said and hadn't yet decided what to do with it. One of his attorneys placed a binder on the board table. Margaret Oakes looked at Cole. "Mr. Maddox." Cole stood. He left the notebook on his chair. He walked to the podium and stood behind it for a moment, looking at the board, looking at the room, the neighbors, the reporter, the former customers, the 12 petition names who were presumably somewhere in the rows behind him. He didn't look at his notes. He'd prepared what he was going to say, but he'd prepared it the way he prepared for anything that required precision under pressure, until he didn't need to refer to the preparation anymore, until it was just something he knew. "I want to tell you about a diner," he said. The room was quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they weren't expecting what they're hearing. "About 4 months ago, I stopped at a diner after closing the garage. I was tired. I had bills on my kitchen counter and a daughter waiting at home. I paid my bill and I put my jacket on and I was going to leave." He paused. There was a woman being publicly humiliated by her date 2 tables over, mocking her, loudly, while 11 other people in the room looked at their plates or filmed it on their phones. He could feel the stillness in the room, not hostile, listening. "I almost walked out," Cole said. "I want to be clear about that. It would have been easier. I had 100 good reasons to keep moving and 0 reasons to get involved with a stranger's problems." He looked at the board, at Margaret Oakes specifically. "But I didn't walk out. I sat down beside her and I told the man that the humiliation was done, and he left." It took about 90 seconds. He paused. "I didn't know who she was. I didn't know her name. I found out later that she's the CEO of a company I'd heard of but couldn't have told you much about. What I knew in the diner was that she was a person being treated badly in front of a room of people who'd decided it wasn't their problem. Another pause. And then she asked me to sit down, and we talked for 20 minutes. And I told her I was a widower with a daughter and a struggling garage. And she told me her name was Sloane. And that was the entirety of our acquaintance when she came to my garage 3 days later. He looked briefly at Warren Blackridge. Warren's expression was controlled, but there was something careful in it now, the expression of a man who had prepared for a specific kind of opponent and is recalibrating against a different one. She came to my garage, Cole said, turning back to the board, and she made me a business offer I almost turned down because I didn't want anyone to think what some people in this room may have been told to think, that I'd been bought, that I'd taken charity and was pretending otherwise. He set his hands on the sides of the podium, not gripping, just resting. I eventually accepted a minority investment with full operational control retained by me. I had an independent attorney review the terms before I signed anything. The agreement is a matter of record. I am happy to provide the board with a copy, and I'd ask you to read it, because it says exactly what I've just told you it says. He opened the notebook. Not dramatically, he just opened it, found the page, looked at it, and began. Beginning approximately 6 weeks after the investment became public knowledge, the following things happened to my business. He read the log. Not all of it, he'd selected the entries that built the clearest picture, that demonstrated pattern rather than coincidence. He read dates, times, names where he had them, descriptions where he didn't. He described the supplier cancellations in the specific language each supplier had used, because the language was oddly similar across multiple companies, similar in a way that coincidence doesn't usually produce. He described the inspections. He described the anonymous customer messages and how many customers had reported receiving them within the same 2-week window. He described the break-in, not dramatically, just factually, date, time of entry based on camera footage, duration of the intrusion, what was disturbed, what was not taken. He described the man who had come to the garage under a pretense of needing service and the vehicle registration that connected him to a security consultancy with a billing relationship with Blackridge Automotive Group. He closed the notebook. Kept this record, Cole said, because I've been in situations before where the difference between a bad outcome and a manageable one was whether someone was paying careful enough attention to document what was actually happening. I kept it because someone was trying to take something I built, and I wasn't going to let them do it with my eyes closed. He looked at the room again, at the neighbors. At Tom Gruber, who he could see now in the third row, who gave him a short, firm nod. Tricia Dole. At Marcus, who had come without being asked, and who was sitting very still with his arms crossed, and his expression closed, in the way Marcus's expression went closed when he was feeling something strongly and had decided not to perform it. I'm not going to tell you I'm something special, Cole said. I'm a mechanic. I'm a father. I've had some bad years and some better ones, and the garage is what I have to show for the better ones. He paused. What I'm asking this board to look at is not whether you believe me over someone who came in here with attorneys and binders and 4 months of organized preparation. I'm asking you to look at the evidence, because I didn't come here with a story. I came here with documentation. He picked up his notebook and walked back to his seat. The room had a different quality than it had before he'd spoken. Couldn't have named exactly what had changed. Nothing dramatic had happened. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made accusations by name except once, hadn't done anything that a room could point to and say that was the moment. But the temperature was different. Margaret Oakes looked at both parties, then at the board, then at the binder Warren's attorney had placed in front of her. We'll take a 15-minute recess, she said, and then we'll hear from Ms. Everhart. The recess was actual chaos managed quietly. Warren's lead attorney moved to a corner of the room and spoke in a low, rapid voice into his phone. 2 of the board members clustered at one end of the table, talking with their heads close together. The reporter was writing at speed, which Cole took as a reasonable indicator that something had shifted. Cole sat in his seat. He opened the notebook to a blank page and wrote nothing, he just held the pen, because having something in his hands gave his hands something to do that wasn't balling into fists. Sloane appeared beside him, her wheelchair positioned at the end of the row. That was good, she said quietly. It's what happened, Cole said. I know, that's what made it good. She paused. Are you ready for my part? That's your part to be ready for. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in her expression. He didn't fully catalog something that had been there, in varying degrees, since the diner, and that he'd been choosing not to examine too closely, because examining it felt like opening a door he wasn't sure he was ready to walk through. I have everything, she said. I know you do. The recess ended. Margaret Oakes called the room back to order and nodded to Sloane. Sloane opened her laptop. She spoke for 22 minutes, and the 22 minutes had a different quality than either Cole's or Warren's address, not because she was more persuasive, but because she was more precise. She had the specific organized cadence of someone presenting an earnings report, which in a sense was what this was, a forensic accounting of where Warren Blackridge's money had gone and what it had purchased. The shell corporations came first. She named 3 of them, traced the ownership structure of each through the public filings that documented it, and mapped the payment relationships between them on a diagram she projected from her laptop onto the wall screen at the front of the room. The diagram was clear, without being simplified, the kind of thing that takes real expertise to produce, that looks obvious only because someone has done the work of making it look obvious. Then she went through the specific financial relationships. The PR company that had pitched the newspaper story had received 3 payments totaling $64,000 from a holding company. The holding company had a single active investor relationship. That relationship was with a subsidiary of Blackridge Automotive Group. She showed the communication records. Not content she had been careful about what could be legally obtained and had held to that line, but metadata that established timing. Messages from an account registered to a Blackridge subsidiary, to the account of a former executive of the supplier company that had been the first to drop coal, sent in the 48 hours before the supplier called. A pattern of contact between Blackridge-connected accounts and several of the 12 petition signatories in the weeks before the petition was filed. Closed the laptop. What I have presented, Sloane said, looking at the board, is a documented pattern of coordinated interference with a legally operating small business by a competitor with a financial motive to damage my company's investment interests. The mechanic at the center of this campaign was chosen not because of anything he did, but because someone calculated that he was an accessible pressure point. Paused, and her voice was even in the way it was, even when she was managing something underneath it. They calculated incorrectly. She returned to her position at the end of the row. The room was very quiet. Warren Blackridge said from his seat, "I'd like to respond to these allegations." "You'll have the opportunity," Margaret Oakes said in a tone that established who was running the meeting without making a production of it. She conferred briefly with the board members on either side of her. Then she looked at Warren, Mr. Blackridge. "The evidence presented by Ms. Everhart involves financial documentation and communication records. Do you have documentation that contradicts any of the specific claims she made?" Warren's lead attorney leaned toward him. They spoke quietly for a moment. "We would need time to review the materials she presented before." "You've seen the payment trail diagrams?" Margaret Oakes said. "We have concerns about the methodology of the investigation that produced." "That's not a documentation dispute," the board member to her left said. He was a younger man, maybe 45, with the expression of someone who had spent years learning to identify when people were answering questions they hadn't been asked. "Do you have documentation that contradicts the payment relationship she described?" Another attorney conference, shorter this time. "Not at this time," Warren's attorney said. The room absorbed that. Then Cole stood up. He hadn't planned to speak again. But there was something still in the room that felt unfinished, not legally, not evidentially, but in the human sense of things that need to be said before a door can close properly. "Mr. Blackridge," Cole said. Warren looked at him. Cole spoke to him directly, not to the board, not to the room. "You went after my business. You went after my reputation. You sent people to go through my office in the middle of the night." He said this quietly. Not as accusation, the accusation had already been made with documentation, but as a statement of what had happened, laid out plainly between 2 people. "Those things I can deal with. I dealt with them." He paused. "But you sent messages to my customers that reached my daughter's school. You put things into her community, the community where she grows up, where she goes every day, that she had to hear from another kid's parent in a parking lot." He looked at Warren steadily. "That was a different thing. And I need you to understand that I understand it was a different thing. Not so you'll feel bad about it. I don't particularly care whether you feel bad about it. So that there's no confusion about what happened and what it cost, and that the cost was not only mine." Warren Blackridge held Cole's gaze for a moment, then he looked away. Not in the dramatic way of a defeated villain conceding the field. Just away. To the table in front of him, to his attorney's hands, to the middle distance of a man who has encountered someone he underestimated, and is in the process of understanding what that means. Cole sat down. Margaret Oakes called the board to deliberation. The deliberation took 11 minutes, during which the room held its particular quality of suspended time, the reporter writing, the attorney checking his phone with an expression that had lost its earlier certainty, Warren sitting very still. Marcus uncrossed his arms and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees in the posture of someone who has been waiting a long time and can feel the wait ending. The board filed back in. Margaret Oakes read the result in the flat, procedural language of official findings, which translated to the following. The business practices of Maddox Motor Works were found to be in compliance with all applicable community standards. The investment relationship with Everhart Dynamics was found to be transparent and properly documented. Petition was dismissed. The board voted 6-1 to approve the expansion permit that Cole had applied for 3 months earlier, and that had been held in procedural limbo since the petition was filed. The single dissenting vote was from a board member Cole didn't recognize, who offered no explanation. After the gavel came down, the room decomposed into small groups and individual conversations, the way rooms do when something that had been holding everyone in a particular configuration is released. Warren Blackridge left without speaking to anyone. His lead attorney lingered long enough to collect the binder from the board table, then followed. The younger man with the tablet was already at the door. Cole watched them leave. Tom Gruber found his way to the front of the room and shook Cole's hand with both of his, which was more physical expression than Tom usually deployed. Patricia Dole said, "I'm bringing the Subaru in Monday," as if this had ever been in doubt. The reporter introduced herself, Yolanda Marsh, Regional Business Desk, and asked if Cole was willing to speak on the record, and Cole said yes, briefly, and gave her the 3 sentences he'd decided he was comfortable with, that the garage's records were clean, that the board had confirmed as much, and that he hoped the finding would clarify things for anyone who had questions. He did not editorialize about Warren Blackridge. He did not call him anything. He did not describe what had been done to him in terms that would feed a headline he'd have to live with later. Yolanda Marsh seemed mildly disappointed by this restraint and wrote it down anyway. Marcus appeared beside Cole after the reporter moved on. 1, Marcus said. 6-1, Cole agreed. Who voted against? No idea. Cole looked at the board table where the members were gathering their things. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter, Marcus agreed. You need a ride? I can drive you back. I've got the truck. Marcus nodded, started to move away, then stopped. For what it's worth, the thing you said, about what it cost. About Ruby. He paused in the way Marcus paused when he was choosing words carefully. I know, Cole said. All right, Marcus said and went. Cole turned. Sloane was still at the end of the front row. Laptop closed and returned to the satchel, watching him with the expression he'd been not examining for 4 months, and that he was, in this particular moment, allowing himself to look at directly. He walked over. 6-1, he said. I caught the deliberation audio, she said. The dissenting vote was someone who thinks the board overstepped its mandate by weighing in on investment relationships at all. It wasn't a vote against you specifically. Good to know. She looked at him. The room was emptying around them, voices and footsteps moving toward the door, but neither of them moved toward the door. You didn't tell them, she said. No. About the seals. About any of it. No, she was quiet for a moment. Why didn't you? I told you why. You told me the strategic reason. I'm asking the other reason. Cole thought about it. He wasn't someone who gave quick answers to real questions if he could avoid it. Because I came home from that life to build something else, he said. A garage, Ruby, a life that didn't need to be explained by what came before it. He paused. I don't want the thing that carries me to be the thing I used to be. I want it to be the thing I actually am. Sloane looked at him for a long moment. The thing you actually are, she said, turned out to be sufficient. Just barely. Just barely is sufficient, she said. He almost smiled. She caught at the almost, the thing that didn't quite arrive, and something in her own expression shifted in response, the same almost quality, both of them, holding something at the edge without quite crossing it. I owe you, Cole said. You don't. The investigations was protecting my investment, she said, which is true. And also not the whole truth. But let's let it be the sufficient explanation for today. He nodded. They left the hearing room together, Cole walking and Sloane rolling alongside him, and went out into the November air, which was cold enough to see your breath and clear enough to see a long way. In the weeks that followed, things changed in the specific way that real change happens not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, like a tide coming in. Yolanda Marsh's follow-up article ran 6 days after the hearing. It described the board's findings, referenced the documentation Sloane had presented, and included 2 paragraphs about the coordinated supplier pressure campaign that read with the specificity of someone who had done further reporting rather than simply writing what she'd been told. The article was not a vindication piece, it was a business article, practical and measured, but it said what it said in a publication that reached the same people who had read the previous one. The following Monday, Patricia Dole brought in the Subaru. Tuesday, a family Cole hadn't seen since October called to reschedule the service appointment they'd canceled without explanation. He scheduled it without mentioning the gap. Several people who hadn't called simply came in. None of them explained themselves, which Cole appreciated. Explanations, in his experience, were mostly for the benefit of the person who owed them, not the person they were owed to. Customers came back, and Cole serviced their vehicles, and the gap in between was left in the past where it belonged. Marcus took on a half-day Saturday shift without being asked, just showed up and started working. When Cole pointed this out, Marcus said he'd decided the garage could use the extra coverage. Cole did not argue, the expansion permit was activated. What had been a storage space at the back of the building got cleared out, framed, and gradually converted into a third service bay, not immediately. Not in a rush, but in the way of a project that has been planned and is now simply proceeding. Cole did much of the physical work himself, on evenings and weekends, in the particular way he worked when something needed to be built rather than fixed. Ruby came in on the Saturdays when the construction work wasn't loud enough to require hearing protection, and she updated her clipboard to include the new bay with a drawing of it that was architecturally approximate and optimistically spacious. "You drew it bigger than it is," Cole told her. "It's how it's going to look when it's done," Ruby said, with the certainty of someone who has decided this is the case. Cole looked at the drawing. "Okay," he said. Meanwhile, Sloane had forwarded the financial documentation to state investigators not as a headline move, not with a press release, but quietly, through the appropriate channels, with a cover letter written by her attorneys that said exactly what it needed to say without embellishment. The investigation opened in the 3rd week after the hearing. Cole read about it in 4 sentences in the business section of the regional paper and noted it in his notebook, not because he needed to, but because the notebook had become a record of this period of his life, and this belonged in it. Warren Blackridge stepped aside from his company's operations 6 weeks later, citing personal reasons. Cole read that too. He sat with it for a moment. He did not feel triumphant. He felt something quieter than that, the specific, complicated feeling of an outcome that is correct without being satisfying. The feeling of having been through something that should never have needed to happen. The newspaper that had run the original article published a correction. It was not prominently placed. It used careful language. Efficient. Cole cut it out and put it in the notebook. Not the front, the back, on one of the blank pages at the end. One evening, about 3 weeks after the hearing, he was closing up the garage alone Marcus had left at 5. The last customer had picked up at 6. And Cole was doing the end-of-day walkthrough that he'd done every working day for 3 years when his phone rang. He answered without looking at the screen, assuming it was Marcus calling about something he'd forgotten. "Sloane, I have a question," she said, instead of hello. "All right, the diner. Patty's Corner. Are you still going there on Tuesday and Thursday evenings?" He'd told her that, he realized, months ago he'd mentioned his routine in that first conversation, the way you mention things when you're talking without quite tracking what you're volunteering. "Usually," he said. "Why?" A pause that had become, over the months, a familiar quality, the pause she used when she was deciding how directly to say something. "Because I'd like to go," she said. If you don't mind the company." Cole stood in the empty garage in the quiet with the phone in his hand. He thought about the diner. He thought about the empty chair. He thought about the way she'd said sit down that first night, not as an order but as an invitation that hadn't known how to sound like one yet. "Thursday," he said. 7 o'clock, Thursday, she said. 7 o'clock. He locked up. He drove home. He made dinner, helped Ruby with a geography project that required coloring a map, and produced significant debate about which shade of blue was correct for ocean versus lake, and put her to bed at 9. He stood in the kitchen afterward in the yellow light, with his hands around a cup of coffee that was going cold. He was not worried. He had not been worried for some weeks now, and the not worrying had settled from a notable absence into something closer to normal, which was itself a remarkable fact. He thought about Thursday. He turned off the light and went to bed, and the house was quiet, and the garage was locked. And Ruby was asleep with the dog pressed against her side, and Cole Maddox lay in the dark and understood, for the first time in longer than he could easily calculate, that the feeling settling through him was not the absence of something hard. It was the presence of something else. He lay with it a while before he slept, careful with it the way you're careful with a thing that's new and real and that you don't want to mishandle. Then he slept. Thursday came the way Thursdays come, when you've been thinking about them slower than normal days and somehow also faster, the hours between morning and evening having a different texture than usual hours. Cole closed the garage at 6, which was 30 minutes earlier than his standard close. He didn't acknowledge this to Marcus, who noticed it anyway and said nothing, because Marcus was the kind of person who filed observations without requiring them to be confirmed. He drove home, changed his shirt, not into anything he didn't own already, just the cleanest one. The dark gray one Ruby had once said made him look like a person rather than a mechanic, which he'd taken as a compliment in the spirit it was probably intended. He fed the dog. He left a note on the kitchen table for Mrs. Calloway from next door, who was staying with Ruby until 9, that said, "Leftovers in the fridge. Ruby knows where everything is. She will try to negotiate a later bedtime. The answer is no." Ruby appeared in the kitchen doorway while he was writing it. "You look different," she said. "I changed my shirt." "You combed your hair." "I comb my hair." "Not like that," Ruby said, with the forensic specificity of a child who pays very close attention to the adults around her. She studied him for a moment. "Are you going to the diner?" "Yes." "With Sloane?" He looked at her. "How do you know that?" Ruby shrugged the elaborate, full-body shrug of an 8-year-old who has information she's been sitting on for a while. "You've been a certain way today. You're only that way when something involves Sloane." She considered this. "Or when the truck needs work and you're deciding whether to tell me how much it costs." Cole set down the pen. "And what way is that?" "Careful," Ruby said. "Like you're holding something." He looked at his daughter, this small, serious, perceptive person who had watched him navigate 3 years of hard things and had apparently been cataloging his tells with the patience of a scientist documenting a subject in the field. "Yes," he said. "I'm having dinner with Sloane." Ruby accepted this with a nod that was trying to be casual. "Okay," she said. "Say hi from me." "I will." "Tell her Sergeant Biscuit finally learned to shake hands." "I'll mention it." "Tell her it only took 3 months." "Ruby." "Okay," she said. She turned to go back to whatever she'd been doing, then stopped. "Dad." "Yeah." She looked at him with an expression that was, for a moment, not 8 years old at all, something older and more considered, the look of a person who has thought about something carefully and decided to say it. "She's good," Ruby said simply. "Sloane, she's good." Cole stood in the kitchen for a moment after Ruby disappeared back down the hall. "I know," he said to the empty room. He drove to Patty's Corner. Sloane was already there when he arrived, which surprised him. She'd beaten him by what he estimated was 5 minutes, long enough to have her water and her menu both positioned with the particular settled quality of someone who had been waiting comfortably rather than impatiently. She was at a booth near the back, not the same booth as the night they'd met. That one was occupied but close enough that Cole noticed, and he thought she'd probably notice too. He slid into the seat across from her. "You're early," he said. "I'm always early. I find it reduces the amount of time I spend watching doors." Deb appeared and filled Cole's water glass without it being asked, in the way of a waitress who has been in the same establishment long enough to run on autopilot for the regulars and reserve her attention for the variables. "The usual?" Deb asked Cole. "Please." Deb looked at Sloane. "First time it is," Sloane said. "The patty melt is good," Deb said. "So is the soup if you're cold." "I'll have the patty melt," Sloane said. Deb wrote it down and left. Sloane looked at Cole with a faintly amused expression. "She recommended what you're having," Sloane said. "She's been recommending it to everyone for 12 years. She's not wrong." Sloane looked around the diner, not the appraising look of someone measuring it against somewhere better, but the genuinely curious look of someone taking in a place that matters to another person and wanting to understand why. Cracked vinyl, the laminated menus, the counter where 2 regulars were having a conversation that had clearly been going on since long before Cole arrived and would continue long after. "Comfortable," she said, in the real sense, not the decorative sense. "It's the same as it was in 9987, Cole said. "The owner's daughter runs it now. She changes the soup specials, but nothing else." "Smart," Sloane said. The food arrived faster than either of them expected, because it was a Thursday, and the dinner rush had already thinned, and they ate and talked the way they'd been talking for months easily, without the performing of ease, the conversation moving through practical things, and then into less practical things, and then into the kind of territory that opens up between 2 people when enough time and enough shared difficulty has accumulated between them. Cole told her about the third bay that the framing was done, that Ruby had revised her clipboard diagram twice, and the current version was, he had to admit, closer to accurate than the first one had been. Sloane told him about a board meeting she'd had that week, one of those meetings that requires 3 times the energy of the actual content, because of the politics around the content, and she described it with the specific, dry humor of someone who has been doing something long enough to find it absurd without finding it intolerable. Cole laughed a real laugh, not a polite one, and Sloane looked at him when he laughed the way she sometimes looked at him, like it was a thing worth looking at. Ruby says hi, Cole said. She also says Sergeant Biscuit learned to shake hands. It only took 3 months. Sloane smiled. I want to see that.
You could come Saturday,
Cole said. He said it without planning to, which was how he said most of the things that mattered not from calculation, but from the point where an honest impulse runs out of reasons not to speak. Sloane looked at him. Saturday at the garage? Ruby's there Saturday mornings. I'd like it. She held his gaze for a moment. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street, its headlights sweeping briefly across the diner window. Okay, she said, Saturday. They sat in the diner for 2 hours. When they left, Cole walked with her to the car and her driver, and they stood in the parking lot in the November cold, and Cole said good night, and Sloane said good night, and neither of them moved for about 3 seconds more than was strictly necessary for saying good night. Then they went home. But something had opened, and they both knew it, and knowing it was enough for now. Saturday morning, Sloane arrived at the garage at 9:15. Ruby, who had been told Sloane was coming, and had responded with a carefully managed version of the same not-casual nod she'd given on Thursday evening, was waiting in the second bay with her clipboard when the black sedan pulled in. The introduction between Sloane and Sergeant Biscuit, who Ruby had brought specifically, in direct violation of Mrs. Calloway's policy about the dog visiting the garage took 4 minutes and resulted in Sloane laughing harder than Cole had ever seen her laugh, because Sergeant Biscuit, upon meeting someone new, offered his paw with the grave solemnity of a diplomat at a formal function, and then immediately sat on her foot. He does that, Ruby explained seriously. It means he likes you. If he doesn't like you, he just walks away and doesn't look at you. What an efficient system, Sloane said. I taught him that part, Ruby said, and Cole thought. She absolutely did not teach him that part, but he said nothing because Ruby's pride in the dog's natural personality was one of the better things in his current life. What happened that morning was not dramatic. Sloane sat in the office and worked on her laptop for part of it, which she'd said she would do, because she had things that needed doing, and Cole respected that she wasn't coming to watch him work. She was coming to be in the same place, which was different and better. Ruby circulated. She talked to Sloane about her book, then about the biography of the woman with the interesting hat, then about a dispute at school that had apparently been resolved in a way that was technically correct, but emotionally unsatisfying. A distinction Ruby was old enough to understand and young enough to still find frustrating. Sloane listened to all of it, with the same quality of attention she directed at board meetings and business negotiations fully, without condescension, engaging with the actual content rather than the age of the speaker. Cole watched this from the bay, where he was replacing brake pads on a pickup and had a clear sight line to the office window. He watched Ruby say something that made Sloane look thoughtful. He watched Sloane say something back that made Ruby pick up her pen and write on the clipboard. He watched the two of them in the small office. In the thin morning light, one adult and one child having a conversation that needed no mediating, no facilitation, no parental translation. He went back to the brake pads. The year that followed was not a clean year. Nothing real is. The third bay came online in March, and with it came the particular growing pains of expanding a business that has been calibrated for a specific size new scheduling systems that didn't work right the first time. A second employee who turned out to need more oversight than Cole had projected. Period in April when 3 major jobs came in simultaneously, and the coordination nearly broke down before Marcus stepped up in a way that cost him 2 consecutive weekends, in which Cole paid back in a bonus that Marcus argued against and accepted anyway. There was also the morning in February when Cole's truck finally gave up in a way that was not repairable within any budget he could justify, and he spent a Sunday afternoon in the lot staring at it with the specific grief that attaches to objects that have carried you through difficult periods and can no longer continue doing so. Ruby sat beside him on the cold asphalt for about 10 minutes without saying anything, which was exactly the right amount of time, and then said, "Dad." Truck, which was also exactly the right thing to say, even if it wasn't entirely the point. He bought a used one. It was fine. Sloane came to the garage most Saturdays. Not all of them. She had a company to run, travel that couldn't always be rescheduled, obligations that Cole never asked her to minimize because they were the actual shape of her life. And he wasn't interested in a version of her that had been flattened to fit more conveniently into his. But most Saturdays, and in the evenings, twice a week, one of them would call the other, and those calls had the particular quality of calls between people who have stopped needing reasons to call. The first time Cole told her he cared about her, he did it in the parking lot of the garage at dusk on a Saturday in April, which was not a planned moment. He'd been walking her to the car, and she'd said something he couldn't remember exactly what. Something about the apprenticeship program they'd been discussing, a structured plan to bring veterans and single parents through the garage for paid training. And he'd stopped walking, and he'd said it, plainly and without architecture. I care about you. I want you to know that I do. Sloane had looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. Then I care about you too, Cole. I've been waiting for you to be ready to say it. How long have you been waiting? She considered since about February. That's 2 months. You're methodical, she said. I've come to appreciate that about you. He kissed her in the parking lot because the parking lot was where they were, and there was no better time than the actual moment. And he had spent enough of his life waiting for the right conditions to do important things, and had learned that the right conditions are mostly a story you tell yourself while the moment passes. Kissed him back, and it was not perfect. His chin was rough because he hadn't shaved that morning, and she laughed when it ended. And he laughed too, and neither of them said anything about it because there was nothing useful to say about it. The apprenticeship program launched in May. Sloane funded it through a small nonprofit structure. They set up together her financial architecture, his operational design, a governing framework that took 6 weeks and 2 attorneys to finalize, and that Cole read every word of before he signed anything, which Sloane had come to expect and which she considered a feature rather than an inefficiency. The first cohort was 7 people, 3 veterans in various stages of transition, 2 single parents who'd been working in unrelated fields and wanted a trade, and 2 young people who had, in various ways, run out of the kind of opportunities that don't require someone to give them a chance first. Cole designed a 16-week curriculum that mixed technical training with the business knowledge he wished someone had given him when he was starting out, not the theoretical kind, but the applied kind, the kind that answers questions, like how do you talk to a supplier who's shorting you, and what do you do when a customer disputes a charge in bad faith? And how do you decide which debts to pay first when you can't pay all of them? He taught it himself in the mornings before the garage opened. Marcus became the secondary instructor for the technical components, which he approached with the same quiet competence he brought to everything, and which the apprentices responded to with the respect that competence reliably generates. On the anniversary of the night, Cole stood up in Patty's corner. He took Sloane and Ruby back to the diner. He had not made a production of the date. He'd mentioned it to Sloane 2 weeks earlier, matter-of-factly, and asked if she wanted to go, and she'd said yes without making a production of it either, which was one of the things he'd come to understand about her. She felt things deeply and did not require fanfare to prove it. They sat at the same table, not the same booth, different, slightly toward the back, but the same general territory of the room. Deb, who had served Cole long enough to know that something was different about this particular Thursday without needing to ask, brought menus and coffee and a chocolate milkshake for Ruby that was large enough to be technically unreasonable and that Ruby addressed with the serious commitment of someone who has been given a task and intends to complete it. Sloane looked around the diner. It looks different, she said. It looks the same, Cole said. I know. That's why it looks different. She looked at him. I was in a pretty bad state the last time I sat in this room. You held it together well. I was furious, Sloane said, and humiliated, and very aware that a room full of people were looking at me and deciding what story to tell themselves about what they were seeing. She paused. And then you walked over, and you were so ordinary about it. You weren't trying to be a hero. You were annoyed that you had to get involved. I was. That was the part that got me, she said. Not the standing up. The fact that you clearly would have rather not had to. Cole thought about that. Courage isn't about wanting to do the hard thing. It's about doing it when you genuinely prefer not to. Ruby told me something like that, Sloane said, a few months ago. She said you'd told her that courage is just deciding someone shouldn't have to stand alone. Cole looked at Ruby, who was working on the milkshake with concentrated attention. and was apparently not listening to adult conversation, except that she absolutely was, because she always was. I said something like that, he said. She's been thinking about it, Sloane said. She told me she's been looking for chances to go first. Cole looked at his daughter. Ruby, sensing the attention, looked up. What? She said. Nothing, Cole said. Drink your milkshake. Ruby pointed at Sloane's untouched coffee. You should drink yours too. It's getting cold. Thank you, Ruby. Sloane said, with complete sincerity, and drank her coffee. They sat in the diner for an hour and a half. No cameras, no reporters, no opponents in the room. Just Deb refilling coffee, and the couple at the counter conducting their ongoing conversation, and the rain beginning outside in a light way. Not the hard rain of a year ago, but the tentative kind that can't quite commit. Cole thought about what the year had contained. The hearing and the black cover notebook, and Warren Blackridge's face when he looked away. The brake pads and the broken truck and the February morning in the lot. The apprenticeship cohort sitting in folding chairs in the garage at 7 in the morning, some of them skeptical. Some of them desperate, all of them there, because they needed someone to go first and give them a chance. He thought about the specific, ordinary shape of a life that has come through difficulty and settled into something sustainable, not triumphant, not arrived, but genuinely present and moving forward. He thought, this is what it looks like from the inside, not the victory, the after, the Tuesday morning and the garage door and the coffee and the work. Cole, Sloane said. He looked at her. Where did you just go? Here, he said. I was just thinking about here. She looked at him with the expression he no longer tried to not examine, the one that had been there since the diner, in varying degrees, since the night she said, sit down to a stranger who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Good, she said. Stay here, I'm here, he said. Ruby looked between them with the expression of a person who has observed something and decided to let the adults have it without editorial comment, which was an exercise in restraint that Cole recognized as costing her something. Can I get another milkshake? Ruby asked. No, Cole said. Smaller one? How small? Ruby held her hands about 8 inches apart. That's still a milkshake, Cole said. It's a reasonable milkshake. Cole looked at Sloane. Sloane looked at Cole. The look lasted about 2 seconds and contained a complete conversation that neither of them needed to have out loud. A small one, Cole said, and then we go. Ruby signaled Deb with the efficient authority of a child who has identified an ally in the room. Here is what Cole understood. Sitting in the diner with the rain going light against the windows and his daughter negotiating a second milkshake and the woman he loved across the table from him, he had spent 3 years after Elena died surviving. Not poorly, he had held things together, kept the garage alive, kept Ruby fed and known and loved. But surviving in the sense of forward motion conducted primarily by not stopping, by not letting the momentum of the days lose itself entirely, by putting one foot and then the other, and not looking too far ahead, because looking too far ahead revealed too much open ground. He had not known during those years that what he was building toward was this. He had not had the clarity to see that far. He'd only known that Ruby needed a father who showed up, and the garage needed an owner who worked, and he was both of those things. And being both of those things was sufficient reason to keep going. What he understood now, sitting in Patty's corner, a year after a 90-second decision in the same room that he'd nearly not made, was that sufficient reason to keep going sometimes delivers you somewhere you couldn't have imagined. Not perfectly, not cleanly, not in the way of stories that have been arranged for maximum emotional impact, but actually imperfectly, incrementally, through wrong turns and fixed trucks, and documented break-ins and parking lot kisses in the rough-chinned cold actually delivered. He thought about the diner that night, the 11 people who found something to study on their plates. Teenager with the phone. The woman sitting across from a man who was saying things that a room full of adults had collectively decided weren't their problem. He had almost decided the same. He still thought about that sometimes the 2 steps he'd taken toward the door, the jacket on his shoulders, the weight of the day and the bills and the reasonable argument for keeping his eyes forward and walking out into the rain. The thing that stopped him was not heroism. He wanted to be clear about that, at least to himself. It was not some noble impulse or a selfless calculation or anything that would make a compelling origin story. It was something smaller and more stubborn than that. The simple inability to watch something wrong happen and file it under not my problem without losing a piece of his own sense of what he was. He didn't think of himself as a particularly brave man. He thought of himself as a man who had on one rainy evening been unable to locate the part of himself that would have let him walk out the door, and who had, in not walking out, stumbled into a chair across from someone who changed his life. There was a lesson in that, he supposed, though he was cautious about lessons, because lessons tended to make things neater than they actually were. If there was one, it was this. The significant moments rarely announce themselves. You don't feel the weight of them in advance. You only feel the choice small, unglamorous, inconvenient, and then you feel whatever comes after it, for better or for worse, and usually for both simultaneously. The choice he'd made in this room had cost him nothing and given him everything. He was aware that this was not universally how it worked. He was aware that some people make the hard choice and it costs them anyway, and they don't get the year that followed his year. And the math doesn't come out right, regardless of the integrity of the person doing the arithmetic. He'd seen enough of the world to know that, but he'd also seen enough to know that not making the choice doesn't protect you from the cost. It just changes what you've lost. Ruby's second milkshake arrived. It was, objectively, not that much smaller than the first one. Cole looked at Deb, who looked back with the expression of a woman who has been making her own decisions about portion sizes since before Cole was born and is not particularly interested in negotiating them now. Cole let it go. Sloane was watching him again. She did this, watched him. When she thought he was somewhere in his head, which he did more than he realized, and which she'd told him once, she didn't mind. You come back, she'd said. That's the part that matters. What are you thinking? She asked. That Deb gives Ruby whatever she asks for, and I have no jurisdiction here. True, Sloane said. What else? He looked at her across the table. In this room where it started, with the rain going soft outside, and his daughter making engineering progress on an unreasonable milkshake. That I'm glad I didn't walk out, he said. Sloane held his gaze. So am I, she said. Ruby looked up briefly from the milkshake. She looked at her father, then at Sloane, then back at her milkshake, with the expression of someone who has seen what she expected to see and is satisfied. She said nothing. She was getting better at knowing when not to. They married the following September, on a Saturday afternoon behind the renovated garage, in the space where the parking lot widened into a concrete apron that Cole had cleaned and strung with lights the previous evening, with Marcus's help and Ruby's supervision and Sergeant Biscuit's enthusiastic interference. It was not a large ceremony. 23 people. The apprenticeship cohort 6 of the original 7, one of whom was out of state but sent a message that Marcus read aloud, badly, and then cleared his throat and handed to Cole to finish. Patricia Dole, Tom Gruber, Patricia Nguyen, the attorney, who had come on what she said professional curiosity and spent the entire ceremony looking like someone who was glad she'd come. Yolanda Marsh, the reporter, who had been invited because Cole had decided that the person who had written honestly about the hard part deserved to see the other side of it. Sloane wore a dress the color of deep water. Ruby wore a dress she'd chosen herself green, with pockets, which she'd insisted on, and which Sloane had immediately agreed to because Ruby's insistence on pockets in formal wear was, Sloane said, exactly the kind of person she wanted standing beside her. Ruby stood between them. She held both their hands. The officiant was a retired judge named Harold, who got through the whole thing without any line that sounded like it had been used at 700 previous weddings, which Cole had requested specifically and which Harold delivered. At the end, Ruby squeezed both their hands at the same moment, which was not part of anything they'd planned, and which Cole felt in his chest in the specific way that small, unplanned things hit harder than arranged ones. Later, after the food and the talking and Marcus's toast, which was 4 sentences long and exactly right, and the moment when the first apprentice cohort member pulled Cole aside to say that she'd been hired as a junior technician at a shop in the next town and wanted to say it here, in person, on this specific day, Cole stood with Sloane at the edge of the lot, in the early evening air, and looked at the garage. The sign was new. Not different, the same name, Maddox Motor Works, but repainted, the letters clean and visible from the road, in a way they hadn't been before. Ruby had consulted on the color. The third bay was open. Tomorrow it would be a work day. Job scheduled. Parts ordered. Marcus coming in at 7:30. Are you ready to go in? Sloane asked. The guests were still in the lot, the conversation still going, the lights still strung above the concrete apron. Ruby had found Sergeant Biscuit, who had been tied to a post near the side entrance, and had spent the ceremony in an escalating state of social frustration at being excluded from the main event, and was now showing him the milkshake she'd saved from the catered dessert table specifically for him. Not yet, Cole said. They stood there another few minutes. The September air was cooling now, and the lights above the lot made the concrete look almost warm. And inside the garage, the tools were where they'd been at the end of yesterday and would be at the start of tomorrow, the place he'd built to still the standing, when the day was over. He'd built it for Ruby first, then for himself, then, without planning to, for the people in the apprenticeship chairs. And somewheres in the middle of all of that, it had also become the thing that brought him to the diner on a rainy Tuesday evening when he was too tired to cook, and the rest of it had followed from there. He thought, a life is a long series of decisions you make without knowing what they're pointing toward. And most of them are small, and most of them pass without consequence, and a handful of them, the ones you almost didn't make, the ones you made while your jacket was already on, and your hand was almost on the door, a handful of them turn out to be the ones that mattered. The night Cole stood up in the diner lasted less than 90 seconds. He'd spent most of those 90 seconds wishing he were somewhere else. He had not been brave. He had only been unable, finally, to be the person who kept walking. The life that came from that inability was standing beside him in a dress the color of deep water, holding his hand in the September evening while their daughter fed a milkshake to a dog who was technically someone else's. It was imperfect. It was real. It was his. He was not surviving it. He was living it. And that, he had come to understand, was the whole of the point.